All right, hey everybody. I'm going to be doing chapter 8 today. I don't know if I'm going to have a chance to do chapter 9 on Thursday because I have a minor medical procedure that isn't super serious, but is going to make it so that I have to be partially sedated, which means I might not be coherent enough to do a live read Thursday. So I'll try to reschedule it and get it back up. Also, I know that the YouTube videos have not been updated yet. I'm going to do that right after this stream. So everything will be on the YouTube channel after this. So we're on chapter 8 of the Shield, and just to recap, we're going back to Trem and Yulinar, where he is being healed by Athor Einelmon, Wrath's mother. That'll be followed by some insight into what is going on in our Angladeus, where Arvadas is dealing with a challenge to his authority as the king, and also they're still struggling to deal with the Marlpaz fortress that's keeping them trapped. So, be a couple breaks in scenes for this chapter. Trem awoke from a dreamless sleep, the first he had had in a long time, to the light from the window shining into his face. He was lying in a canopy bed, swirling white silk curtains hanging from the bedposts. He was confused at first, unsure where he was or what had happened. Then he remembered the water and the pain. He touched his face and felt the scars, not as pronounced as before, but still present. Closing his eyes, he flexed his legs, and they responded. In shock and joy, he opened his eyes to see that Athor Einelmon was now standing at the end of his bed, a small smile on her face. We were not able to undo the scars, not entirely. Trem brushed his face again and said quietly, "It's fine. I do not want to lose them, not entirely." Trem flexed his legs once more, and this time he noted the stiffness in their response. "Can I stand?" Athor came round to one side of the bed. "You were unconscious for most of the night, last night and day. Your fellow half-elf was insistent on staying by your side, though I did persuade him to go with Kaliandra to the Temple of Endoth and pray today. The healers would say you should not strain yourself, but I doubt that would stop you." She extended a hand, and Trem took it, leaning on her heavily. He swung his feet round the edge of the bed slowly and set them on the floor. It took the better part of a minute, but he was able to rise. Athor Einelmon held him up as he tested his strength. He wobbled and looked at her sheepishly. "I never thought I'd know what it felt like to have the legs of an old man. Trapped in your Nivellen as you are, I suspect that is true, but this will pass. However, you should take an important lesson from the experience. You are ageless, not endless, and weakness may take you yet, even if time does not." Trem's brow furrowed as he considered Athor's words. He leaned on her a bit less and tried to place greater weight on his own legs. As he was getting his balance, the curtain of the room was pushed back, and Joven, looking tired but determined, stood there. His face lit up, and he rushed forward, embracing Trem so fiercely he nearly knocked him down onto the bed. Trem grunted but laughed softly. "I'm not fully recovered yet, you know." Joven stepped back, but left his hands on Trem's shoulders. Kaliandra stood behind him, smiling from the doorway. Neep was with her as well, though Diaga was nowhere in sight. Athor spoke to Joven. "He will need time to regain his mobility, perhaps a few days, but he will have willing servants to assist him, though I suspect you'll want to help as well, Jovanileth." Trem swayed a bit, and Athor Einelmon eased him back onto the bed. He insisted on sitting up, but felt weak already. The Malarian gestured to one of her servants, who left the room, returning a short while later with a wheeled chair made of light and thin wood. "This will allow you to move about with assistance, but it will be at best a few days before you can walk on your own." "We don't have a few days," Joven said. "There's an army marching on Aves to the north. If the fortress falls, then all of Lagosha is effectively lost." "Yes," Athor said simply, "that is true, but it does not change the facts. There are ways to speed your journey, but they little matter now while Trem is still recovering." She cocked her head as she looked at Joven. "Unless you wish to leave him here." "No," Joven was quick to answer. "Maybe we could get word to Logan and the others to start north without us. One thing at a time," Trem said. "You have to understand what you're dealing with and come up with a plan, not just go rushing off to fight an enemy you can't hope to defeat alone." Joven seemed to shift defensively as Trem's tone changed to one similar to the man who had abandoned Delmore. "What I mean," Trem said, "is that you need allies in a course of action." Joven remained unmoved. "And are you one of those allies?" "I don't know yet." Athor interrupted then. "But he should not know. I realize this upsets you, Jovanileth Blade, but Trem needs to see and hear many things before he can truly understand what he should do, what he wishes to do. I can promise you that there is time. Not much, but some. Can you take me at my word?" Joven looked at her, then at Trem and sighed. "I don't like waiting. It feels wrong, but you healed him like you said you would, and you've given us aid when you have every reason not to. I will trust you." "Maybe there is something that you could do for Joven, as a show of good faith, Keeper Athor." Trem glanced at his fellow half-elf, who seemed puzzled. "When we first met, I swore to help Joven find his missing father. We came south for a number of reasons, but mostly because moving north was impossibly dangerous, despite Joven's suspicions his father was somewhere in the former Napoleon Empire. If you were able to learn of my future, and that of the city, Is there something you could do for Joven to help him locate his father? Javaneleth swallowed and nodded at Trem, his eyes taking in Athor Einelman with a burning light of hope. She met his look, but only briefly. Pushing the wheelchair forward, she said, "We should talk first, Trem Waterhound, and perhaps it would be more pleasant for you amid the light and sun of my city." Trem seemed about to insist on an answer to his question, but Kaliandra intervened then. "Joven, maybe you could come with Neep and me to learn hand speech. She made some progress yesterday, but more company might encourage her to try even harder." Neep purred happily at the suggestion, and Joven gave his consent. The three took their leave as Athor brought the chair to Trem. With her help, he was able to sit in it and be carried down the many stairs by Athor's rugged servants. At the base of the steps, she put her hands in the back and began to push him slowly out of the doors and into the street. Trem put his own hands up to shield his eyes, as the brightness was stunning even compared to the well-lit chambers of Athor's home. She turned him down the road and began a steady pace towards the square. "We can sit between the wells, before the great library, and watch the multitude that comes and goes. I think you will find it fascinating, and it may provoke the right sort of discussion between us." Trem said nothing, taking in the sights of finely robed nobility, hawkers of wares, street performers, and all manner of people in between. The darkness of skin among the Malarians had ceased to be something remarkable for him, but he was astounded at the extent of hairstyles and the audacity in some of the jewelry. His head turned to follow more than a few passer-by, and he in kind was the subject of many stares and whispers. Many said hello or bowed politely to Athor, who responded in kind with nods and words of greeting. Trem had known she was important, powerful, and maybe even a bit feared by the people here, but not to the extent to which she was so recognized. As they reached the square, Athor pushed him to the center of the wells as promised and produced a broad parasol from the back of the wheeled contraption. She opened it and set it on the ground, unfolding small standing legs at the base, and stood on the opposite side of the chair watching the milling crowds. They said nothing for some time, Trem simply observing all manner of different people going about their business, while Athor seemed to be meditating on the experience itself. After some time, nearly an hour, she turned her head and asked over her shoulder, "Are you thirsty?" Trem had not thought of it, but felt he was. "Yes." "Then we will go to one of the wells, and you can taste the most prized of Ulanar's treasures for yourself." Trem thought she would push him to the chosen well, but instead she offered her hands. It took him several minutes of leaning, bracing, and pain to rise, but he was on his feet. The plod to the well was agonizing, more because of its pace than any discomfort, but after some time he managed to reach it, and he rested his hands on the grainy stone at the edge. Catching his breath, he smiled at her in triumph. Returning his expression of joy, Athor lowered one of the 6 buckets on the circular edge of the well, waiting for the feeling of resistance that did not take long to come. "We have been fortunate. This has been a good year for water, and the wells are deep with it." As the container began to come back up, Trem asked, "How many wells are there?" "In the city? Perhaps 100, but they all come from the same deep reserve beneath us. It is why Ulanar is here, why the Dominion exists, because there was, and always has been, water here." "How many people are there in this city? It seems so vast when we were coming in." Athor set the bucket, now full, on the lip of the well and stepped back to allow Trem to taste the water. "The city supports a population of about 180,000. Trem paused before his lips touched the water. 180,000. That's impossible. Athor laughed. "You might think so, but we are resourceful, and if you consider how inhospitable the Endless Sands are, it stands to reason most live here. There are hardly any among the rest of our lands, except for a few on the oases around in the towns of Worth and Khazar, which have far smaller wells of their own." Trem drank deeply of the remarkably cool and clear water. It tasted as though he had never had water before, not such as this. He gulped a bit more, then leaned back to allow Athor to have some as well. She took a cupful in her hands and swallowed it, eyes closed, and sighed. Trem could understand her reverie. This water even felt to him like a religious experience, and he was not from a place where it was so precious. Athor extended her hand, bidding him to drink again. "We keep the population carefully controlled. No woman may have more than one child unless they are twins. We know that the city cannot sustain more than 200,000 people, so we must be careful." "What if a woman does have a second child? What then?" "Exile, for both mother and infant." Trem said nothing, feeling it was not his place to question the practices of his host and her culture, but it seemed Athor Einelman knew what he was thinking. "It is a cruel law, as are many of our laws in the eyes of outsiders. We live in a harsh place, this city being a beacon of civilization in a land that should perhaps not be civilized. Much of what makes the Dominion what it is exists as contradiction. Like the way you've treated me, despite what I represent to Ulanar." Athor replaced the bucket in the well, and carefully poured out the unused water, making certain none clung to the sides of the stone walls. "Your death was not something I wished for, but I understand those who did. In times of fear we rarely think of others." Trem felt a tug of memory, and the cruelty of Delmore and his abandonment of Joven came back to him. "Yes, that is true." Athor turned to him and stared deep into his eyes. "You will need to see what I have seen to understand, Trem Waterhound, and you will need to speak to those who allowed you to become what you are. Only then can you decide what you should do, if you will succumb to destiny or fate. You said before that fate was something chosen for us, and destiny is what we choose. How do I know which path I'm on?" Athor smiled. You don't. She turned and went to retrieve the chair, packing up the shading parasol as she did. Trem leaned against the well, his legs feeling weak and tired from standing, and looked up at the bright sun. He sat forward again and saw the two were no longer alone. The listener, Farah ein Tevanir, was standing between them both, flanked by perhaps a dozen cohorts, sages in various colors of robes, their approach having somehow gone unnoticed by Trem and his host. Athor paused and bowed her head in greeting, but did not stop in her task, bringing the chair to Trem. The half-elf could feel the threat in front of him and would not sit at first, regardless of how much his legs cried out for it. Now you act as nursemaid to the instrument of our destruction, Keeper. I wonder if you will retain your title when this is over. Farah folded her hands in her blue robes and took a few steps closer, dropping her voice slightly. The highest of our orders will convene to decide what is to be done about this deadly presence in our midst. In 2 days' time you will bring him to us, and the vote shall be made again. I trust the outcome will be the same as the last time. Athor turned, after finally easing Trem into the chair. That is rather audacious of you, listener, given the vote narrowly passed before. It is no matter. Trem Waterhound is not of the Dominion, and is under my protection. I will invoke the right to stand for him and accept what punishment is doled out, if any, for my transgression. Faraz's eyes flared in anger. While you deserve punishment, you would do this only to once again ensure the downfall of our city. Where is your loyalty, Keeper? You would side with this foreigner against your own. I side with the world, and all mortals, not just a select few. I will accept the judgment of the sages. Both Farah and Athor, who had been staring at one another so fiercely the air fairly crackled with tension, turned their heads in shock at Trem's pronouncement. I will not allow Keeper Athor to suffer for coming to my aid. In 2 days' time I will face the judgment of the high sages. Athor attempted to intervene, but Farah was quick to cut her off. He's accepted. It is done. 2 days, Trem Waterhound, and we will see what the sages determine is to be your fate. The listener swept away with her retinue, leaving Trem and Athor alone by the well. The keeper turned, for once her eyes seemed unhappy with him. But Trem looked back at her unwaveringly. I'll need to learn what you would teach me before that time, if I'm to argue on my own behalf. Yes, Athor Ein Alman said gravely. We must return to my home at once. There's something I need to show you. The town of Guayaquil had all the solemnity and silence of a funeral, one being held for the very place itself. The streets littered with refugees from the east were packed to the gills now with even more people who'd fled the oncoming army of the broken. The 4 main roads, each leading to gates representing the 4 compass points, were so full that it was impossible to lead carts down them anymore. The fear of inevitable destruction had driven some to fly west, hoping to reach Aves or Halden Bay ahead of the pillaging army, but most were too tired or weak to even attempt escape. The town was overrun with people in need and did not have even a quarter of the supplies necessary to aid them. In the Inn of the Four Winds, what constituted Guayaquil's defense council was seated at a worn table. Not much was said, for their choices were few. They could arm perhaps 1,000 men well and scrape together half that number again, who would have makeshift weapons, and it would be of no use against the invaders. They had sacked Delmore at great cost, but not one person had made it to Guayaquil, and the residents had suggested a total slaughter of all who resisted. The decision now was whether or not to fight back. There were the throngs of people afraid of the invaders, holed up in the town walls who would demand protection, but what protection could be offered? They might hold out for a few days or a few weeks, but eventually the town would fall. Osmandius would not come, Aves would not come, the townsfolk were alone. Were it up to Mera, the innkeeper, they would have fought to the last breath of every last man, woman, and child. She was a stout woman and not brave, but had an immense sense of pride in her home. She'd grown up here, tending to the inn with her parents, and had taken it over, now with her now deceased husband, when they passed the duties to her. She had hidden from when the dreadful creatures had come looking for the travelers in the inn some months ago, but even while under the bar she had clutched a vicious carving knife, unwilling to die without some kind of fight offered to her enemy. To hand over Guayaquil to the invaders, bullying and burning their way across the dust plains, was abhorrent to her. Edward, the gruff, balding blacksmith, was of similar mind. This was their home, and if they were going to die, they should do so in defense of it. But others were not so certain. The merchants had banded together and determined to try and salvage some sort of peace. Guayaquil had never taken sides in war, they said, and while this was true, the town had nearly been destroyed by gnolls hundreds of years before. Was that not a war Guayaquil had taken a side in? Perhaps, but the orcs had come to the town's aid. So too had Angladeus. There was no one coming now. Peace was the best option. It did not seem like such a horrid idea, but the way of securing peace might be far more detestable than the result. The broken would want tribute of some kind, money, weapons, who knew what else. And then what? They would take those things and use them against others who were brave enough to stand and fight them. Then would Guayaquil have helped those better men and women to their deaths by supplying the enemy. But the determination to fight was strongest only in Edward and Mera. The others were afraid, and bargaining seemed a better way to avoid what made them tremble so. The meeting adjourned quickly, and the whole council headed for the ramparts. Climbing the palisade steps, they could see the banners of the broken in the distance, covering all the hills around Guayaquil. Not one gate was unwatched by thousands of eyes. Outside of the town, those who had not made it in when the doors were barred now pressed desperately against her walls, as though they would save them even though they stood on the wrong side. The Broken had been looming over Guy the Kill for 2 days, yet they had not made a move. The council stood on the walls of the east gate, studying the foe in the distance. The leader of the merchants took the flag handed to him by a militia member, a white sheet tied to a spear, and held it aloft, waving it in furious insistence of surrender. On the eastern hill, Hrothgar sneered from atop his horse. You see, I told you they would cave. All we had to do was show them there was no point in fighting and wait. Valissa did not look at him, sitting just to his right. Yes, and if we had attacked right away and rolled over their defenses, they would have surrendered 2 days ago. Hrothgar's smile evaporated. He kicked the shoulder of a man closest to his mount. Go and deliver the message that we accept their surrender and will come to parley outside the gates in 1 hour. The soldier ran forward swiftly to communicate the terms of negotiation. Hrothgar, now in a foul mood due to Valissa's remark, said, We can burn the place to the ground and move on by tomorrow. There are hordes of refugees outside the walls and likely more within. We'll not be able to resupply here. Valissa snorted. You're a fool, Hrothgar. So we accept their surrender and destroy the town. Then what? Where do we go to resupply when we start moving further west or south? What's our new encampment between Nepal City and Aves? What will we use as a staging ground to take Osmandius and the Orc holds? She rounded her horse in front of his and stared at him. You continue to pretend as though you're some master strategist and general, but all you've ever commanded was a gang of thieves and criminals. This is not the underworld of Nepal City, and you're not master here. We accept their surrender and negotiate terms, leaving Guy the Kill intact and able to help us. The time spent on that matter will not be a waste. She rode off before Hrothgar could reply. The Thane of Conan was furious, but such a feeling when it came to Valissa was second nature by now. They had never been close to begin with, but the months of campaigning had greatly soured the already contentious relationship. It did not help that she had, in the past several weeks, turned a number of former Napoleons into several of her own personal companies, numbering around 1,000 men and women in total. It had taken all of the best trained and disciplined men from out of the broken clans and gangs, leaving her with a small but very adept fighting force. Hrothgar had his own men, housecarls or loyalists from his criminal dealings in Nepal City, but she outnumbered him now. He had archers, enough to see to his own defense, but a full-fledged fight with his rival would be a costly one for him regardless of the victor. The only thing keeping them from each other's throats was the danger of the Broken themselves. Even combined, Valissa and Hrothgar's number of loyal soldiers was dwarfed by the vast quantity of the Broken. Gornath had successfully purged a number of his closest rivals during the attack on Delmore, and anyone who would have opposed him still was suitably intimidated by both he and his Knoll contingent. They had possessed almost 10,000 fighting men at Delmore. Recent recruitment and, in some cases, impressment of locals had helped them reach 15,000. It was the number most believed would ensure victory over the Order of the Eagle Knights. Even weak as they were rumored to be, the fortress of Aves remained a daunting challenge to overcome. Gornath had his plans for that, but it was going to cause yet another delay. They had been intending to move swiftly, striking Aves before word reached them of the impending threat and winter had set in. Both possibilities were lost now. The cold had seeped down from the north and frozen the lands all the way to the midst of the Silverleaf Forest. The spring would be some months off. Could they have what they needed before then? Hrothgar assumed they would, but that would mean letting Wolfbane down. He had demanded a quick end to the war so they could examine how to redistribute forces in preparation for the next phase of conquest, but it seemed the matter would take longer than Hrothgar had promised. Gornath, mostly recovered from the beating he'd taken at Delmore, walked silently past Hrothgar's horse, catching it off guard. The Broken leader examined the town indifferently and said, Did they ask to parley? Yes, we should have word from them soon. Good. The two waited in silence until the soldier returned, confirming the elders of Guy the Kill would meet them at the east gate within the hour. Hrothgar dismissed him and turned to Gornath. You will need to come, of course, but leave the knoll behind. We don't want to start a panic or have those beasts tear off in some kind of blood-crazed killing spree. I'll leave Gren here, but I'll be doing the bargaining. Without waiting for an answer, Gornath left Hrothgar seated on his mount, about to respond. The infuriated High Thane spun his horse and headed to his tent, deciding that a draught of wine before the encounter might make it mildly more tolerable. Another break. Arvada sat in his home on Zenith Road, his grandson on his lap, drinking a strong mug of hot, dark liquid and attempting to will his mind to alertness. Logan was playing with a number of pewter soldiers on the table, narrating an epic adventure of his own creation, while Arvadas was in quiet and somber contemplation. A few weeks had passed since he'd given over to Eladria Hladic's request, and now his streets were swarmed with armed men and women bearing heater shields with the solemn face of Varanus, god of truth. Publicly, Arvadas had stated that they were out to restore order and righteousness. Privately, he felt he had sanctioned some form of volatile inquisition. A rap came at the door and he set Logan down. As he was standing, Graham, his oldest and most trusted guardsman, opened the door and said, High Lord Calavar to see you, sir. Arvadas nodded and moved to the pantry, looking for something to satiate his friend after the journey across Alderlast. Runadin came in, offering a broad smile for young Logan and bending his knees lower than he would have for any lord or lady to embrace him. They chatted casually about his ongoing toy soldiering. Then Runadin ruffled his hair and told him to head down the hall so he could talk to Arvadas. Dutifully, Logan gathered his things and left, still telling himself the next chapter in his homegrown epic. Arvadas brought a hot mug of the same dark liquid to Runadin, who took it gratefully. Is this that foreign drink you told me about? From dried and roasted beans in Westia, I was given some by High Lady Vendile as a token of gratitude for putting my faith in her. Calavar grunted. The name still feels like a dagger in the ribs, but I've met her. She's a wise woman for being so young and gifted in her craft. He sipped the drink and pondered the taste. Not for me, I think, but I'll give it the full cup before I say for certain. Arvada sat at his small table, Calavar joining him. Thank you for coming. I wanted to speak to you somewhere that I knew was safe. Given the truth seekers roaming every nook and cranny of the nation, I doubt that such a place exists anymore. Calavar dropped his air of friendliness and pointed a thick finger at Arvadas. I've known you a long time. How could you possibly allow something like this to happen? There are innocent people being interrogated, having their smallest violations of morality and the code dragged out in the open to their shame. And to make matters worse, the bastards make them kneel before Varanus, Honatha, and Paladinus and ask forgiveness. I don't think I need to tell you, such prostrations have not yet yielded a response from our favored gods. High Lady Hladek believes that Carcyrus was able to undermine the values of our nation because our people have gone astray. Nothing else seems to be working to save us from the dark force pinning us within our lands. Perhaps a reinvigoration of faith is worth the cost. You don't actually believe that. Arvadas sighed. No, I do not, and that's why I asked you here. Calavar cocked his head in confusion as Arvadas continued. Eladria knows something more damning than my son Logan's transgression with Lena, something that could bring harm to my family, especially given the presence of these zealots in our streets you just described. Calavar sat upright then and closed his eyes. She knows about Varasho. What? Arvadas was shocked. How could you guess? What do you know? Calavar chuckled. Arvadas, your eldest was in my care for some time. I trained him when he was a boy, helped prepare him for the rite and his other tests, and I commanded him as a young man. Who do you think he turned to when he needed guidance? Calavar's voice dropped slightly. You should know well that in war, when men train and fight and die so close to one another, bonds form, powerful ones. Sometimes they are bonds of brotherhood, and sometimes they are something more. The king was taken aback, more by the revelation of his friend's depth of understanding than the fact that he knew the truth about his son. Arvada studied Calavar, his head was downcast. So he came to you because you knew? He may also have suspected I shared his struggle. The king's eyebrows climbed still higher. Oh, come now, Arvadas, it's not difficult to reason. You've heard the rumors. I never married, never had children. Neither has Arindian. Calavar laughed. In that way we are similar. Neither of us has the time for marriage, at least now. Arindian has love for nothing but books and words. He'll marry some day and produce an heir to his house or name one just because it is the practical course of action. I could have done the same, married, I mean, but I simply chose not to. They can say whatever they like about me. When I was younger, I was strong and brave enough to shrug off any accusation. Now I'm just too old to care what others think, and the Paladins and Ungladeus have been family enough for me. Of course, Runadin, but you understand my fear. Calavar looked at his cup for a time and took a long sip before answering. Yes, the truth seekers would find him in grave violation of the code. Perhaps they would even try to use rumor to manipulate me, though they would be proven wrong if they used their divine power to force the facts from my lips. Thus far, they've taken only to force penitence and calls for forgiveness of the accused. But if men and women of real authority were found in violation, it might mean something far worse. How were you able to help Varasho so? He's kept his secret so well these years. I thought I was the only one who knew. Calavar shrugged. I told him to embrace the code and his faith in Paladinus, even if he saw his desires as contrary to those teachings. I know that made him difficult to raise and drove a wedge between he and Logan, but I think it saved him from something far worse. We have no idea, Arvadas, what it's like to grow up a servant to a faith that constantly talks about your most basic feelings as calamitous sins, to feel that a part of who you are is in some way a violation of everything you stand for. Calavar shook his head somberly. It makes it very difficult to stand for those same tenets you do believe in, but you do so because you love the realm and its people. Arvadas was quiet, but he extended a hand to his friend. I would stand with you regardless of the completeness of your faith. I know, Calavar said, and your son knows that too, which is why he was able to tell you years ago. His hard by their demeanor is a form of protection against his own shame. I wish he did not feel there was something flawed in him, but not everyone can accept who they are. He may grow to feel differently eventually, but then again, he may never find peace with who he is. Sadly, Arvadas said, our concerns are more of a practical variety. Somehow Eladria Hladek knows my son has no desire for women, and she threatened to expose this to the public if I did not give her what she asked. Who's to say she won't expose him anyway? Calavar struck the table in anger. The threat alone is dirty, underhanded move on her part, and I don't think you should trust she would stop there. Arvadas, you have to get Varasho out of Ungladeus. How? Arvadas asked. We're trapped here. Would you have me send him through Silverleaf, risking death and losing his way? Send him to Trinilith Port, Calavar intoned solemnly. Give him a ship, a few men, find a cause for him to serve, and he will do it. Damn it, Arvadis, you're doing nothing here, and you know there is something far worse than that mere fortress outside our borders. The gods only know what those Narathians have done to Nepal. We've had no alliance or bond to them. There's nothing that requires us to come to their aid, but we're still Anglo-Daix. We're supposed to stand against wrongs and right them. Calavar's face had grown red with anger, but he calmed down slightly and picked up his cup once more. Instead, we're sitting here, overseeing a witch hunt among our own. Arvadis took a sip from his mug as well. He stared at the windows of his home, but he spoke to Calavar as he watched the steady march of civilians and truth-seeker regiments. How am I supposed to tell my son that he must leave because I ordered those like him to be interrogated for their sins? What sort of father am I? If you don't send him away, you're a far worse father than if you do. Arvadis stood and walked to the fireplace, staring at the portrait of his wife he had mounted over it years ago. He rubbed his eyes with a free hand, for the tiredness in him had not faded despite the strong drink High Lady Vendile had gifted him. He turned from his musing and said, If I'm going to exile my son, I need to send him to do something that will aid us here in Anglo-Daix. I agreed. Have we ever had any contact with the Nepalians? Any word from Hethagar or Lowwinter? Calavar shook his head. I can't say for certain. Renan would likely know better, but I don't believe so. Still, there are rumors of Nepalian rebels in the Whitewood. Tales heard from the few traders that still come down to Trinilith Port. They just haven't asked for our assistance. Maybe they aren't able to. Arvadis stood quietly for several minutes before continuing. It seems mad to send my son out of one danger to another, potentially greater threat. None of the options are good, but send him with others you can trust. Maybe he finds success. Arvadis was silent for some time, considering what ought to be done. He did not want to send Varasho away, his other son already so far from home and in grave trials that the king could only imagine. What sort of father would he be, sending his eldest to field to seek out foes in enemy territory? Yet he knew the longer Varasho remained, the more danger he was in. Runadin was more tapped into the faith and holy orders than Arvadis. If he feared for Varasho, then things must be dire indeed. Arvadis sighed in concession. I'll see about getting word to Lowwinter. Maybe we can contact someone from the resistance there, or find a sympathetic host for a small contingent to do some reconnaissance. Can you make contact with Renan and explain the situation? Leave Varasho out of it, but come up with some rationale for sending him anyway. Runadin stood, leaving his mug of dark liquid mostly untouched. I'm happy to do it, Arvadis. I know this is not what you want, but in these uncertain times it's for the best. I hope you're right. Another break. The barrels of black powder had come from Barrow, along with 3 experienced miners willing to take the risk of approaching the Great Wall between the Pillars of Light. Rumors of servants to Varanus, sanctioned by King Arvadis no less, raiding homes and exposing the sins of the people had reached the war camp, and the soldiers were even more on edge than they had been previously. The miners, for their part, had chosen to come largely to avoid the spread of interrogation in their smaller town, though upon seeing the task that they would have to undertake, they had begun to doubt the wisdom of the decision. Varasho had overcome much of the fear by letting all involved know that he would be going with the group that was attempting to burrow under the wall. Boehmer had been largely in charge of determining how the attack would play out, but he would remain with Renan to charge in once a breach was made. The newest High Lord had decided that, in addition to using the cover of darkness, he would provide protection for Varasho's covert advance by launching a feinting attack on the opposite side of the wall. Originally he had intended to lead it himself, but given the near-suicidal nature of the assault, Varasho had been able, after much argument, to dissuade him. Boehmer was sizing up the number of small barrels and making rudimentary calculations with the help of the miners. As dusk was falling, Renan and Boehmer moved their force of several hundred soldiers to the right of the wall, leaving a group of a dozen men with Varasho. The prince had each carrying a barrel, with the 9 soldiers also bearing large shields on their backs. When darkness fell deep enough, they began creeping along the edge of the western mountain pillar towards the fortress. A blinding flare of light went up from the opposite side, and a hail of arrows flew against the wall. It was a futile but violent attack. Torches stopped their steady patrol pattern, and men began to cluster near the eastern edge of the wall as the enemy moved to intercept. Roaring at the top of their lungs, men from Renan's force charged the wall. There was nothing he could do but stand and watch as they rushed forward. The archers among them fired arrows and bolts over the battlements once they were close enough to reach the top, and there was little in return from the enemy. The men were nearly at the wall itself, and Renan turned to Boehmer. Have another 500 men ready in case we get close enough. Maybe whatever dark magic protects them has run its course. As he spoke, a belching roar of dark red flames streaked down the edges of the wall and tore through the Anglo-Daix forest, burning so hot that those caught in it were reduced to ash in moments. The few that were able to move aside were hit with a wave of boiling air that scalded them in their armor if they were not cooked alive instead. Shrieks of pain and terror came from the wall, and Renan gritted his teeth as he watched futilely, Boehmer placing a restraining hand on his arm, urging him silently to hold his ground. The feint had allowed Varasho to reach the wall, however, and his men had dropped their small barrels and were striking the ground with pickaxes, churning up vast mounds of earth. The miners had set them to a rhythm that ensured the greatest haste, and soon they were deep enough that small spades were broken out, and they were able to tunnel from within the hole, now almost up to the waists of the men. Varasho kept one eye on their progress, urging them to hurry, while another was locked onto the fortress and the slaughter to the east. The force Renan had sent as a distraction had known their doomed task, but the gouts of magical flame had decimated them and driven those who survived into terrified flight. Varasho looked back at the men, now up to their shoulders and digging aggressively in shifts, and silently urged them to push on. An arrow sailed through the night and struck the earth a foot from Varasho. The torches were coming towards them now, the grunts of men and sounds of metal on loose rocks drawing their attention. Varasho quickly ordered the soldiers to place their shields over the digging miners, setting himself just behind them, and scanning the walls for signs of the dark magic that had shattered the Anglo-Dax to the east. There was a yell from the men in the hole and a cry for the barrels. Two soldiers quickly abandoned their position on the shields and began tossing them down into the pit. Varasho turned and shouted, "Are we certain it's deep enough?" "It won't get any deeper, my lord, before we aren't here to set it alight." Varasho was going to insist they make certain they dug far enough, when an arrow bypassed the shield and struck one of the men in the neck, dropping him gurgling to the ground. Another took a soldier in the leg, and soon the rate of missiles was steady and threatening to break them. A bright flash of light went up from the wall, and he could see a dark figure with one hand aloft, seeming to hold a sphere of red flames. Without hesitating, Varasho held his staff upward and called upon Palladinus and his holy powers for aid. The fire roared down the wall to the defenseless men below, but a beam of golden light flew from Varasho's staff and met it just above their heads. His eyes shone with pulsating power, and he felt himself flushed with strength of faith in God. Varasho had not reached out for Palladinus' aid in a long time, fearing what would happen when he did, but in the face of death he had not known what else to do. The flames were still so hot that he could feel it on his skin, but they stayed clear of the workers. The last barrel was tossed, and Varasho shouted at them to flee. Releasing his call to Palladinus, he threw himself aside. The flames tore downward and enveloped the area he had been standing in, as well as striking the barrels and causing a titanic and deafening explosion. Varasho felt the wave of heat fly over him, singeing his back and legs, but the ringing in his ears told him he was still alive. The sapping unit was hobbling and running for the encampment, most of them apparently unharmed. The prince heaved himself upward, a pain across his body causing him to gasp. Varasho turned, and the cloud of dust and heat made him narrow his eyes as he tried to see the base of the wall to determine if they had succeeded. Behind Varasho, not waiting to see if they'd managed to break through, came a roar of voices and stamping feet as the assault vanguard charged to the wall. Varasho was backing painfully away from the fortress, looking to see if it was indeed breached as they swept past him. The dust continued to clear away, and shouts of torch-bearing men jumping into the ditch came from the wall. Varasho was still staggering and limping away as Gwemmer and Renan reached him, the latter catching his arm and holding him up. All three were watching the wall, the massive men having now found the gap and pressing forward. Gwemmer strained his eyes, unsure if they had made it through. Then it came to him. Why are they not shooting? A great clap, as though of monstrous thunder, came from the gap in the barrier. Men flew backward, armor and weapons and shattered chunks and fragments sailed through the air. Bodies landed with a sickening crunch and squelch as they broke on the ground. Varasho and the others threw up their hands as they were showered with shrapnel and blood. A shimmering glow of soft blues and greens came from the gap under the wall, and a lone figure hovered above it, landing lightly on the ground outside of the hole. Renan looked at the others, then stared at the figure, cloaked in black and lit by shimmering lights behind them, as he stood waiting. Without hesitating, and despite the efforts of Gwemmer to stop him, he walked forward, bringing himself close enough to see what this thing was. The figure's back was to him, clothed in heavy sable and purple robes which dragged on the ground. As Renan was getting closer, the head turned, and he saw that the figure wore a silken scarf wrapped over his face, allowing only his eyes to remain visible. Turning around completely, he faced Renan, arms at his sides, one clad in a heavy black steel gauntlet. Renan stopped some distance away, ignoring the moans and cries of dying men about him and the grisly remnants of their assault. The dark shape in front of him stared, unmoving, as though sizing him up. Renan left his hand away from his sword, reasoning that there was no chance to be able to strike his enemy before he turned his dark powers on him. At last the figure shifted, head cocking to one side as he prolonged his study of the High Lord. Then a dry, crackling voice came out of the scarf. "You are either very brave or very foolish to approach me after I dispose of your feeble attempts to circumvent Marlpaz." "Marlpaz? Is that what you call this place?" The dark figure ignored the question. "In my experience, it does not matter whether bravery or foolishness leads to one's demise. They are dead all the same." A rumbling came from behind the glowing lights cast over the two foes, and Renan could hear the sounds of stone grinding on stone and saw dirt rising from the hole Varasho's men had desperately made. "It is a shame you wasted so many lives in such a feeble attempt to break through my masterpiece, but perhaps now you understand that even if you make it through the fortress, which you will not, it does not matter." The grinding noises ceased, and the glow behind the black-robed figure faded somewhat. Renan was angry at his failure and stupidity, but he would not back down in the face of this fiend. "We will get past your defenses one day, and I assure you your magic will not be enough to save you." Laughter came from behind the thin wrap about the being's face, and its mocking tones made Renan's blood boil. "You really have no idea what's going on, do you? You don't even know who or what you're dealing with. Understand this, Anglo-Daek. We will come for you, and your people when we are ready, and the horrors will be eternal. See if you can stay alive until then, and I'll unmake you myself." The light winked out, the sudden darkness leaving Renan blinking, his eyes to adjust. When they did, he could see the figure was gone, nothing left but the carnage all round and the repaired breach that had existed for a few precious minutes. He turned and walked back to Bwemmer, who was calling over priests and medics to help Verasho. As they lifted the prince bodily onto a stretcher, the High Lord reached them. Bwemmer saw the rage in his eyes and the fear. What was that? The mage in the fortress. He says they'll come for Angdadeus when it's time. Rena watched the men go running off with Verasho to the healer's tents. We're being left to rot on the vine until the enemy decides we've festered enough, and then they're going to crush us. Without waiting for Bwemmer's reaction, Renan walked past him, head down, his defeat weighing too heavy to keep his pride up. So that's Chapter 8. As always, you can reach me through Twitter at Legacy Chronicle and send messages to the Twitch channel. And like I said, I'm going to go now and get these videos put up onto the YouTube page so that playlist for Book 2 is as full as it can be. Hopefully be back maybe Friday, but there will not be a live read on Thursday. At least there's not a planned one at this point. So keep an eye on the Twitter and Facebook threads just to see if anything pops up. Thanks.